Welcome to Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. Today we have on the show Dr. Raymond Winbush, who is the director of the Institute of Urban Research at Morgan State University. How you doing, sir?
Hey, Salim.
Nice to have you on. Today we want to discuss the topic of reparations. Can you inform the viewing audience what is reparations?
Well, reparations is when a nation acknowledges that it has committed a crime against humanity towards some group. It can be in the form of the Jewish Holocaust during World War II, when Germany said we need to pay reparations. It can be towards Native Americans, and how reparations are distributed is also a part of government function. But it's an acknowledgement by a nation of crimes against humanity.
All right. Can you explain to us what is Field Order 15?
Field Order 15. Well, you jump right into it.
Yes,
January of 1865, General William T. Sherman, this was right after the Civil War was over, said that black people should get 40 acres. And there is no mention of a mule in it, but giving somebody 40 acres in that day implied that there would be a mule. So it's like if I said, Salim, I'm going to send you a Lexus or buy you a Lexus, you would assume it had an engine in it.
Right.
So some 400,000 acres were distributed in North and South Carolina, the so-called Georgia Sea Islands, to over 400 black folk over from January to about April of 1865 when Lincoln was assassinated. Immediately after that, his successor, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, took all the land back and gave it to the slave owners, said that they needed to be compensated for the loss during the Civil War.
What is the Freedmen's Bureau bill?
Well, after the Civil War, I mean, even Lincoln said that we should do something to these roughly 4 million Africans who were, quote, emancipated. So they set up what they call Freedmen's Bureaus, and they provided schools. I used to teach at Fisk University, and that was one of the schools that was established right prior to that, but it was all about some kind of compensatory mechanisms for those who had been enslaved. There were schools open, especially in the Carolinas, and a series of measures. It was basically like a place where Africans could go to get guidance, if you please.
What happened to us receiving 40 acres? And I know you said that the president revoked it, but what was the reason for him revoking it?
Well, Andrew Johnson was from the South. He was from Tennessee. And, he was taken or picked by Lincoln to be his running mate because he was trying to, shore up the South since the South had rebelled. But the minute Johnson got in office, I mean, Lincoln was assassinated in mid-April of 1865. He started revoking the land simply because he had pressure from his Southern constituents to compensate them for their loss. I mean, plantations were devastated, and that's probably the only correct thing in that racist movie Gone with the Wind, that all of those plantations were really in bad shape. So by giving that money and even some of the land to North and South Carolina planters, even in Georgia, it was partial compensation or he called it partial compensation for their loss, suffered during slavery.
So now, let's fast forward 2014. I believe the last maybe 15 years or so, or even longer than that, probably about 25 years, John Conyers has sponsored the bill, House Resolution 40. Can you tell us about that, please?
Well, there's a straight line from 40 acres and a mule all the way to Conyers' bill, which he introduced in 1989 as head of the House Judiciary Committee at that time. And it basically called for a study of the impact of slavery on America. Not just, it wasn't a call for reparations, but it was, you have to do a study in the United States on the impact of a crime against humanity. The Japanese had one done for them. Native Americans have had several. So Conyers just called for a study. He didn't say, we're going to give reparation, we just want to study on it. And since 1989, it has been voted down by Republican members of the House. The unfortunate thing, and I guess I should say this, is that when Barack Obama took the presidency, Conyers became head of the House Judiciary Committee, and he could have introduced the bill himself because the Democrats controlled the House. And he was talked out of doing that by Nancy Pelosi, as saying they would divide the country. Right. So it never really got introduced.
Why do you think President Obama hasn't gotten involved in the reparations movement?
Well, I mean, the Reader's Digest version of that would be that, I think that we see our president struggling on issues of race in general.
Right.
I mean, he struggled with, the most recent incident in Ferguson, Missouri, to gather words to do that. Reparations is clearly a divisive issue if you don't want compensatory justice for Africans in America. If you do, it's okay. And see, the cop-out of this is, oftentimes, I remember doing when he was running for president in 2008, he said, well, I don't want reparations, I want jobs, I want better education, blah, blah, blah. All of that is tied into reparations.
Right.
And then some people who say, I don't support reparations, but I support affirmative action. That's like saying, I put it this way, it's like saying that, it's comparing like lemonade to Jack Daniels. I mean, lemonade would be affirmative action. Jack Daniels would be reparations.
Is there any legal basis for reparations?
Oh, yeah. Most definitely. All international courts recognize that crimes against humanity, which means that it involved a huge group of people over long periods of time that were annihilated. The most recent one was Rwanda under the Clinton administration. So it's recognized in law. There's 9 standards. We don't have to go through those now, but I actually have looked at those 9 criteria for crimes against humanity. And in the case of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, we meet all 9 criteria.
Okay, so you mentioned that this is a crime against humanity. Where was that language adopted at?
United Nations, International Criminal Court in The Hague, and it was actually adopted as early as by the League of Nations during World War I. So it's been around for many years. I guess roughly about 100 years.
Can you tell us about the World Conference Against Racism and where reparations played a part in that?
Yeah, I attended the World Conference against Racism in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, and it was the first time in history, even the Pan-African Congresses that Du Bois called together, the Africans from all over the globe got together and met over a period of 10 days in Durban, South Africa. We had met in Vienna and South America and other places, but we were united in the issue of reparations. I mean, totally united. And we got backing from the Palestinians, we got backings from the Roma people, some people called gypsies in Europe, to support the idea of declaring the transatlantic slave trade a crime against humanity. That was a major step forward, because when you say a crime against humanity has been committed, there's no statutes of limitations, and that was the advantage of it.
All right, Dr. Moosh, we gotta take a break. You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. We're discussing reparations. We'll be right back.
Can you tell which of these children was not born free? Can you tell which of these children was not born equal? Can you tell which of these children does not deserve to be treated with dignity? We can't either. Human right number 1. We are all born free and equal. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org.
You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo, and we're back discussing reparations with Dr. Raymond Winbush. Doc, there is the, every year, the Congressional Black Caucus comes to Washington, D.C., and they discuss a plethora of things. Now, to my knowledge, reparations has not been on the agenda. Why or why not?
Well, it's been on the agenda, but it has not as a primary issue. I expect the CBC annual gathering is kind of like, I mean, with all due respect, it's kind of like an adult Freaknik. You know, you've got some of the greatest minds in politics, science, education, entertainment in one room.
Right.
And I used to go to it very regularly. I don't as much anymore. Reparations always is on the agenda. Usually Congressman Conyers sponsors it, but it's not like a thing that they said, well, this is what we're going to focus on. So I think the CBC, with all of that brain power that is there during that weekend, I think they could do better. I mean, it would be beautiful, for example, they had something called like the proceedings of the Congressional Black Caucus, and it would be like an annual summary of what they discussed, but we don't even have that.
Well, what role does the resolutions that's been passed on the municipal or county level play?
Well, I think they play a big role. I mean, the one in California, which essentially said that if your company had any ties to slavery, you had to talk about that and expose it. So that has happened in Illinois under former Councilwoman Dorothy Tillman. It's happened in California. It was in Nashville when I was living there. We passed one, and it's basically was called like a slavery disclosure law. A lot of these banks that we see right now, a good example is J.P. Morgan Chase. They would actually use Africans, enslaved Africans, as collateral for loans. So if you defaulted on a loan for buying cotton seed, you could sell one of your enslaved people as collateral. And they made money off of it. I mean, these banks made money. So you have to disclose that now in many states in the United States.
Well, what do we say to the people that say, okay, that was hundreds of years ago, you're not enslaved now, or some Europeans may say that I didn't enslave you?
Well, I'm always struck when when black folks say, I got another thing, but when white people say, well, why don't y'all just let that be? As a black person, I'm told to remember the Alamo, remember the Maine, remember everything. In fact, we got a thing called Memorial Day. Every 4th of July, America has an orgy, And I think that, but when it comes to enslavement, we're saying forget about it. Don't talk about slavery. You can talk about the Civil War and even engage in reenactments, but don't talk about enslavement. So the answer is, why does America selectively tell us to forget enslavement? Michael Eric Dyson says that with regards to enslavement, we may well be called the United States of amnesia, because we don't want to talk about the most damaging thing that ever occurred to human beings in this country, enslavement, and then the second thing, and not necessarily in those orders, but at least equal to it, the genocide against Native First Nations people. So when black folks say it, I just think they don't know anything about history. I'm sorry, that's how I feel about it. They just don't know anything about history.
Why don't you think any of the major quote-unquote civil rights leaders say anything about reparations?
They do and they don't. I remember a few years ago, Attorney Adjua Ayatora, we were asked to speak before the NAACP. This was right after the World Conference Against Racism, and we were in Milwaukee, I believe it was. And we gave a very thorough presentation, and everybody applauded it, said that we're going to make this a major agenda item on our schedule of things to do, and they didn't. So I think that people, if you ask the average black person, do you think black folk deserve reparations? If you ask a black organization, they'll say yes. Then you say, what are you going to do about it? They say, well, I don't know. That's kind of controversial. And anything that we've ever had and we've achieved has been controversial.
True.
So,
what are some of the things that people can do to achieve reparations?
Well, one thing, they can support the lawsuit in the Caribbean. CARICOM, which is the 15 nations in the Caribbean, have united, and this initial lawsuit is going to be for reparations against the United Kingdom, France, and Holland. And we can support that. I was recently, just a few weeks ago, in Trinidad and gave a lecture, and that's all people in the Caribbean are talking about, is reparations. And they have a good chance of doing it. The European nations are going to resist, of course, right, but there's nothing new about that. I think that's one thing. And the second thing, which sounds real simplistic, that a person could do for reparations, is read about what they are. Because a lot of folk will use the term reparation, they don't even know what they're talking about. You got to be cautious of, well, you don't know what you're talking about. But they need to read about the legislation that white people, Lincoln, Stevens, after the Civil War, introduced relative to reparations.
Well, I don't think that we can talk about the issue of reparations and not talk about Dr. Amari Obadeli. Oh, yeah. And one of the organizations that he helped put together was the Republic of New Africa, right, who said that they wanted 5 states. And then he went on to help put together the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, right, commonly known as NCOBRA. What are some of the things that NCOBRA has done to work towards reparations?
I think NCOBRA, when it was founded in the late 70s, was instrumental in educating people about reparations. Keep in mind that, as I said earlier, there's a straight line from 40 Acres and a Mule up to the day about reparations. You had Callie House in the latter part of the 19th century who got 600,000 ex-enslaved Africans to sign a petition for what she called a pension for enslavement. Then you go into Marcus Garvey, you go into Queen Mother Moore, James Foreman in right, 1969 when he nailed the thing. And so NCOBRA is in that long line. They do education, they do organizing, and they've been instrumental. I would say that their primary job has been to educate Black Americans more about reparations.
Can you tell us about the Indaba movement?
Yeah, back in like 2005, 2006, we had a very, very private meeting in Chicago with Minister Farrakhan, and there were about probably 20 reparations activists at that meeting. We later found out, of course, that at least one, possibly 2 of them were members of the FBI, but we didn't know that at the time. COINTELPRO is still in effect. And we decided to do a series of meetings across the country, Houston, Atlanta. I hosted one at Morgan State where Minister Farrakhan, the whole day was devoted towards reparation. Indaba was named by the late political scientist Ronald Walters. It's a Zulu word that means a great sit down, or when people gather together. So we met in 5 cities. The total attendance was well over 15,000 people. And that it was a place to educate people about what reparations were, and the effects of the Indaba are still being felt.
All right, we're discussing reparations here with Dr. Raymond Winbush. We'll be right back.
Where would I go if the world had no limits? If I could defy all boundaries? If I could ride the wind? Where would it take me? If all roads were open to me, where would I go? If I could fly, if I were free to move.
Welcome back to Sankofa Community Affairs. We're here discussing reparations with Dr. Raymond Winbush, author of the book, Should America Pay? Dr. Winbush, one of the questions that many people ask is, how will reparations be paid?
Yeah.
Now, I know the National Coalition for Blacks for Reparations in America, NCOBRA for short, had six initial down payments. Do you know what any of those are?
I don't know what they are. I haven't revisited them lately, but I know one of them involved education. And it's interesting that the 10-point plan that CARICOM, the Caribbean nations government, is based a large part on the NCOBRA 6 points. They involve health, they involve education, they involve cultural preservation, and so forth. And again, I'm just always struck by the fact that these are consistent histories. Not only, reparations is the only global issue that African people, I don't care where they are, Europe, Caribbean, North America, Africa itself, that they unite on. It's a global issue. That's why I think it's so important. So those areas that NCOBRA outlined and then kind of revised with the CARICOM lawsuit are still major. The health issues. We know that one of the lowest rates of prostate cancer on earth is in West Africa, but black men in America have one of the highest rates. And a lot of this had to do with how the transatlantic slave trade was prosecuted and the effects that it had on us, not only physically, but psychologically as well.
I think you bring up a good point in terms of it being something that can connect African people throughout the diaspora.
Right.
So it's not just a local or national issue, this is an international question. Keeping on the international level, there was a declaration that came out of Dakar. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was called the Dakar Declaration, and a bunch of us wrote it in 2000. It was right before the World Conference Against Racism. And we met in Senegal for about 5 days, and we just, I mean, it was like some of the hardest writing that a bunch of us had ever done. We hammered out what we call how reparations should be distributed. And we gave numbers. We talked about the idea of a World Bank that would distribute money to African people around the world. So it was something that was, I think it was the first time that a group of Africans from around the planet, North America, the Caribbean, South America, we had to get translators and people, and we learned a lot from each other, and we hammered it out. And it can be found online. It's a great document, great document.
Now, one of the things that I was always told is that, what are we going to do if these European nations never give us a dime? And I think about what's going on in Zimbabwe with, you know, the Assistant brothers there taking back the land. How do you feel about that?
Well, see, I think that we gotta, you know, like Malcolm said, Salim, history is our best teacher. You know, people talk about, like you mentioned Mugabe and how he's taken land back from white people, but they forget about the Lancaster House Accords that took place when Zimbabwe, which used to be Rhodesia, as you know, actually had, they promised them $2 billion and never gave it to Margaret Thatcher, never gave the money. So Mugabe negotiated 20 years with these white usurpers to get their land to make it more equitable, and they just kept saying no. So he said, okay, I'm gonna take it. I mean, that's basic. I mean, I'm summarizing it, but that's essentially what happened. I think the African people have to get to the point that when Europeans don't do something, that even before we think they might not do it, we need to plan, this is what we're gonna do. I still say that one of the most effective things to do is the boycott. You know, and the boycott, you know, people say, well, recently people have said to me, well, Ray, how you gonna boycott Ferguson? I live in New York. Boycott Coca-Cola. They said, well, they didn't have anything to do with that. But that ain't the point. You boycott anything that will put pressure on whatever is going on. So the South Africans, I always say, probably during the apartheid era, did the best dealing with what if. They struck. They had, I mean, a national strike. Black folk in this country have never had what one writer called a day of absence. when we just said we ain't showing up for anything. And we need to talk about stuff like that.
A day of absence, that was the basis for Black Solidarity Day in New York.
Right. That's right.
Recently, there was an article in Atlantic magazine.
Oh, yeah.
And I often hear people say, well, reparations is an issue, you know, from years ago. But can you speak to this article? Because I think that it talks about some of the atrocities that's happened to people of African descent in contemporary times, which also make a case for reparations.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote this article called A Case for Reparation, I think that article, and I don't say this easily, that I think it's the most brilliant article that's been written about reparations, and probably one of the great pieces that has been written since James Baldwin. What Coates does, which is so brilliant, instead of starting back at enslavement and moving forward, he starts today and moves backwards. And so what's brilliant about the article is that by the time he talks about housing and this leasing stuff that they did in Chicago, by the time you said, well, we got to give these people reparation. What is happening today is what happened yesterday, and what Coates does is, you know, connect all the historical dots between enslavement and the conditions in the inner city right now. So I gotta say this real quick.
Yes, sir.
For example, a lot of people have said to me in the past few weeks since Ferguson, they'll say, well, how come we always get upset with white on black crime, but we don't ever get upset on black as if they're the same, black on black crime. First of all, I don't even know what black on black crime is. There's white on white crime, Native American on Native American crime, whatever. But it's because the conditions are different. White people killing black people is nothing new. What is new is that after the so-called emancipation, is that this country systematically created a series of laws and living conditions that are in place, the establishment of hoods, if you please, or ghettos, what we used to say in the 60s. And it created conditions that black people started killing each other. And you can tie this in, and Coates does it very brilliantly in that article, which I recommend everybody read. So what we've got to do is what Coates did in the article, is trace history from how we are today and how that is linked to what we were when we were enslaved.
Do you think that reparations is something that is achievable by people of African descent?
It may not be in my lifetime, but I do believe, when I wrote Should America Pay, I said that we would never get reparations for another 20 years. Well, I was wrong, because 2 years after the book came out, J.P. Morgan Chase and the old Wachovia Bank, which is now Wells Fargo, they paid compensations to people in North Carolina as well as in Louisiana. They set up what I call the down payments for reparations. So I think I think I will live long enough to see payments of reparations. I do believe that.
All right, Dr. Winbush, we're running out of time. Can you tell the people how to get in contact with you?
Well, if you're a social media freak, you know, you can get me on Facebook at Ray Winbush, just Ray Winbush, and I'm at Morgan State University, 443-885-4800.
Thank you for coming on,
okay,
sir.
brother.
You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. See you next week.